The state has a legitimate interest to protect the public against the use, possession, in the face of the constitutional attacks launched by the plaintiffs in this matter. Let's try and define the issues for the court in this matter. The issues of whether or not cannabis has medicinal benefits or commercial and industrial uses. There is currently a legislative process before Parliament dealing with these exact issues. Innovations Bill of 2014. I'm not sure if your Lordship has a copy of the bill. I would like to start with the provisions of Section 2 of that bill, my Lord. Of the bill or the act, as it were. Section 2, subsection 3. It reads as innovation in medical treatment and management by supporting reasonable, logical, clinical decisions. Subsection 4. Departure from standard practice. And sub 5, which is very important for purposes of these proceedings, my Lord. Legalize and regulate commercial and industrial uses. My Lord. This is the very process that the plaintiffs seek . File 1, page 33 of the pleadings, paragraph 26.5.
Page 26.
Page 33 of the paginated papers. And it reads that the declaration of invalidity and the relief in consequence thereof be suspended for a period of 2 years. Regulate the cultivation, processing, distribution, sale, possession, and use of cannabis. And this is the exact process that Parliament has engaged in. May I refer your Lordship to the bill again at which is also an important provision for the purposes of our submission. It says, notwithstanding any other law, but subject to the Constitution, no liable or guilty of any offense for growing, processing, distributing, using, prescribing, advertising, or otherwise dealing with or promoting cannabinoids for purposes of 1, treatment, 2, commercial or industrial uses or products identified by the Minister of Trade and Industry in a proclamation of general application published in the which seeks to decriminalize cannabis.
Within that limited industrial uses. Is that
Yes,
correct?
commercial and industrial use.
Yes.
It may include anything, my lord. Remember, my lord, this is a parliamentary process which involves a public may go and make submissions in terms of the bill, and they are not limited to what is outlined in the bill, my lord. For example, you need to restrict it. There are those who would say the bill is not going far enough, you need to widen the scope. All that we say, my lord, is that there's a process in place and courts are required to respect that process, my lord. South Africa, 2009, Volume 2, BCLR 136. This is the Constitutional Court, my lord. Judges, and thus the courts, in our constitutional order, have the duty to uphold and protect the Constitution. Section 38 of the Constitution provides to the actual or threatened infringement of rights. This court has held that relief will not be appropriate unless it is effective. It is this role which we must bear in mind in addressing the question of whether this court may interfere before Parliament has concluded its work. However, the Constitution is replete with provisions that make it plain that ordinarily a court will not interfere with the functioning of Parliament. Of all courts to pronounce on the constitutionality of parliamentary or provincial bills by providing that only the Constitutional Court may decide on the constitution anticipated in Section 79 or 121. I proceed because it's an important judgment, my lord, because we raise the issue of mootness, whether legislation that is before Parliament, my lord. Paragraph 40. In Doctors for Life, this court held that Section 1674B must be understood where to render it invalid. The only circumstances in which this court may entertain the challenge are those provided for in Section 79 of the bill or permitting the president or the premier of a province to sign a bill into law, my lord. So it's not relevant for that purpose here. Paragraph 42. On the one hand, the Constitution requires the courts to ensure that all branches of government act within the law. On the other, it requires courts to and the executive in the legislative process. What the plaintiffs are asking you to do, my lord, is to interfere with that process. Answering affidavit to the striking out application. This is what plaintiffs, my lord. Response to the point made by the defendants that there's a legislative process in place before Parliament in terms of the medical innovation bill. This is what they Oh, yes, respondents are answering affidavit.
Yes.
It says the following, and this is very interesting, my lord, and very critical. Indeed, it was originally sponsored by the late Member of Parliament, the Honorable Mr. M.G.R. Oriani Ambrosini. The decision of this court will serve as guidance, my lord, for the legislature on what to avoid. So, my lord, they've come here to ask for guidance from this court, to ask for an opinion from this court about that legislation. With that parliamentary process. The law is clear, man. You don't use the courts for guidance. Courts are there to deal with real and live issues. Legislative process before they can institute any claim, my lord, concerning the nature and extent of as I indicated, my lord, they have a right in terms of the public participation process So what are we to debate in this case, my lord? If Parliament is looking at that legislation concerning industrial use or commercial use, my lord. My lord, we do not understand why we're here in the first place, in the face of that legislative process. Separation of powers, that's what it is. So that this court cannot, in the middle of that process, dictate to Parliament point, my lord. My lord, we are also not going to debate the issue of religious and cultural by the Constitutional Court in Prince 2. The principle of res judicata on this point.
In which prince?
Yes, I'm talking. Constitutional Court. And that matter will be heard on the 7th of November this year.
Is this the
Western Cape
appeal from the Western
Full Court, yes.
Is that not confined?
Of privacy,
Oh.
yes. What is, we don't know, is the issue of use and dealing in cannabis, perhaps unregulated and uncontrolled. Or uncontrolled use and possession of cannabis. We want a controlled and regulated legislative regime. Parliament. In Parliament. What it means is that they'll be seeking to open up a door for uncontrolled drug dealing and peoples. In our submissions, these proceedings have been launched solely to escape the serious criminal charges that they are facing before the courts. Legal answers and solutions, even to social, political, and as in this case, scientific issues. You may end up with hastily conceived solutions or answers, which may lead to untold consequences. But that which the plaintiffs seek before this court, or what Parliament has to do, if that contemplated legislation is not enough, they should go and make representations before Parliament, give their input. The issue of mootness is fundamental in our law, my lord. There are various judgments. The one point we have to mention issue of justification as raised by the plaintiffs. The plaintiffs must prove an infringement of their issue arise unless and until an infringement of rights is established. this fundamental difficulty that the plaintiffs face, my lord. And this is part of our opening address. We are going to lead evidence. Drug use, drug abuse, especially cannabis, my lord, in the informal settlements and the townships of this country, my lord. They is ravaging our country in places such as Mamelodi, not far from here, Eldorado Park, Kwamashu, Soshanguve, that we live in. The real South Africa, not another world, not another country, or a state in a country afar across the seas. The luxury of their farms, and who scream from afar, and for convenience, the rights of the those mothers, my lord, who will be called as witnesses, will then destroyed by drugs, especially cannabis, including the new generation drugs such as Nyaope, you'll find it here. Of course, the plaintiffs will tell you about development in developed countries, developments around cannabis. By way of science. They will not tell you the stories of South Africa. We live in South Africa with our own history. Poverty, unemployment, inequality. We have our own milieu, my lord. Crime. We will also lead the evidence of those who treat the ever-increasing number who have been harmed and destroyed by the use of cannabis. I think they have a new acronym now. Approves and classifies medicines and drugs and the importance of research. That the availability, all with the aim of ensuring the availability of safe medicines, which is what is contemplated. We get there, that the impugned provisions achieve a legitimate government purpose, and that that legitimate government purpose will also show that any limitation of rights serves an important government. I'm at the tail end of my submissions, my lord. We expect, in terms of and establish facts on which the opinions of the experts are to be based. Paragraph 80. That judgment was referred to you earlier, my lord, during the submissions by
Paragraph?
80. So that, my lord, this court may very well have to decide the issue of whether there is a life issue right at the beginning of this proceedings, my lord. Particularly given those are submissions, my lord.
Thank you, Mr. Bokawa. Mr. Willis.
As your Lordship pleases. My Lord, the correctly have brought before your Lordship a number of defendants in this matter for obvious reasons, my Lord, relating to the facts of the plaintiffs' public prosecution. The Minister of Health, Minister of Social Development, Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Minister of Trade and Industry, Minister of Police. We note, my Lord, unfortunately not the my Lord, this is possibly one of, and there have been others, one of the most important cases to come before our courts, my Lord. The relief which the plaintiff future generations that we have an obligation to protect. Doctors for life, my Lord, of their access to certain scientific evidence, and that forming the very basis on which they have become involved in public litigation in this country over the years. We've had take the obligation of future generations very seriously. It is not the attitude of Doctors for Life the medicinal attributes of cannabis. If they're there, they can, and they are there, my Lord, and they have been isolated. Doctors for Life, my Lord, ultimately contend that the plant as a whole has no future in medicine, because it's in gestation whether it is now produced into an edible substance. But, my Lord, all of those give rise to psychoactive effect on the brain and damage. So, my Lord, just bear with me. At page 60, my Lord, in their plea, my Lord, they deny the plaintiff's case. And they plead that my Lord, whatever the scientists, wherever they may leave the ball for your Lordship to pick up, sufficiently harmful for it to be prohibited. the expert, our main expert, who we will lead, my Lord, is that the current prohibitions of marijuana are strongly supported somewhat different from counsel for the plaintiffs. The science strongly supports the conclusion that marijuana has a high potential for abuse. Assurances of safety for use of cannabis under medical supervision are lacking. The science strongly supports the conclusion that cannabis has met and continues to meet by adults. Sorry, my Lord. Is irrational, and it is rational and necessary the Drugs and Drug Trafficking Act, and equally in Section 21 of the Medicines and Related Substances Act. And my Lord, there are three rational factors which determine whether substance has a high potential for abuse. And your Lordship will hear the evidence of witnesses who have fallen prey to that vice. There are some highly addictive substances, my Lord, that are found biologically in nature that are available medicinally because they have medical. For the State Departments, my Lord, have made submissions on the bill to you, and I'm not going to repeat any of those.
Yes.
And my Lord, lastly, there is a lack of accepted safety for use of the drug or other. My Lord, there will also be evidence that will be dealt with on whether the legalization of cannabis does or does not result in reduced substance abuse and improvement of social. As is seen in other parts of the world, business clamors for the interests of a demand for a drug which, once it addicts you, your financial means, to destroy your families. It would be wonderful, my Lord, if it was possible to control it and allow those who do be ideal. But as our learned friend Mr. Bakaba SC said, this is the real world, my Lord. My Lord, the conclusion and policy implications prepared by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, that's the official name, my Lord, is concluded. Notwithstanding the usefulness of some cannabinoids in the management of specific medical conditions, their use, particularly in the botanical form of herbal cannabis with unknown content and dosage, and efficacy, and the rigorous scientific testing and regulatory systems that apply to established medicines be applied also to cannabis-based medicines. Legislature as has been submitted to you. Lord, cannabis, marijuana, Dagga, as we note, my Lord, it intoxifies and impairs the higher brain function. Our witness will tell you how she has dedicated her life brain. It impairs learning and working memory. It reduces attention span and concentration. It reduces ability to plan, reduces organizational skills. Reduces behavioral control. Impairs motor coordination, increases impulsivity. Must or not, leaving that aside, that it improves hunger or increases hunger, that in the case of HIV. But, my Lord, one of the notorious cannabis, more akin to emaciation than to someone carrying more weight than not. Plaintiffs in your Lordship's court have not rested their cause with the judgment of Davis J. and his two brothers, one brother, I think one sister. That is not adequate in all the circumstances. But, my Lord, we would suggest on the facts before your Lordship, it is because ultimately what legally in cannabis, in the commercialization of cannabis. There are very specific facts pleaded. But it's pleaded how they were caught and arrested, etc. It is common cause, my Lord. If not common cause, it will be established. They were caught with 1 in the region of 480 to 500,000 rands in value, street value. They now come on personal specified facts before your Lordship in order to do that. But, my Lord, is this matter really in the interests of the public? Is this truly public interest litigation? I'm informed that the 1.87 grams or kilograms of marijuana could keep one person smoking a few joints a day for and then, my Lord,
Is that what one of your witnesses are going to testify?
we'll
You
deal with
said
it.
you are informed.
Yes, yes.
This is an opening address.
Yes, it is, my Lord. It is an opening address, my Lord. My Lord, your of indulgence, we've had a democratic dispensation for more than 20, or on 20 now, my Lord. And I think Mr. Bokaba has alluded to this, is that it is for them to establish their prima facie. Part of their case is common cause on the pleadings. We disagree. My Lord, the fact that they were arrested, and you referred only to the arrest, Section 12. liberty and freedom of person, at best. But all the other, I think he said there were 12 different instances. Your Lordship will recall that I made reference to the authority of Stratham Ford, the SCA, during the course of the last 2 days, my Lord. And it's where parties come before court on personal facts. We're not going to hear from the plaintiffs first. And one wonders how that benefits the public, whose interests have been protected by your Lordship's ultimate order.
I understand, just that not at the beginning.
So that might be so.
Yes.
But we are going to traverse, and you've heard our submissions in regard to the summaries. We are going to traverse, because not one of these plaintiffs before you suffers from HIV, let alone schizophrenia. There's no factual basis being laid first. Experts in relation to the factual basis. And my Lord, with reference back to the PwC authority, my Lord, we evidence, much of it hearsay, in relation to matters of no relevance. And so in the course of and hopefully the experts can be of great assistance to us in any joint minute they may provide in due course. My Lord, the Davis judgment we submit is not binding on your Lordship. It is a decision which must yet be confirmed, even if it were a Supreme Court of Appeal decision. It's well, renders it not binding. The evidence will show ultimately there is no trend towards either legalization or decriminalization and regulation of the use of cannabis in societies. And those changes, my Lord, bar one or two, have all come about by ballot or legislation. Lord, you'll also hear the evidence of a Professor Emeritus Forensic Psychiatrist for Doctors for Life, cannabis and its dangers. Assistance to your Lordship in the scientific process. Of course, we have aligned, Doctors for Life has aligned itself in the plea with what is
Yes.
I think you saw that.
Yes.
It's done in a catch-all provision, my Lord. So we will be venturing in evidence into those areas too. Lord, that will be the case for Doctors for Life. Thank you.
Mr. Mohammed.
Thank you. The plaintiffs would then proceed to call their first witness, Professor David Nutt.
Yes.
Lord, the witness has
It's to do with the rules.
My name is David John Nutt. I'd like to take the affirmation. I do.
Do you prefer doctor or professor?
I don't mind.
Feel free to take a seat if you feel uncomfortable.
Thank you. I have bad knees.
Would you please explain to the court what it is that you do?
I am a psychiatrist. I am Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology at Imperial College London. Drugs on the brain. I have worked for 40 years in research. I have studied almost every class of drug that is used in psychiatry, including to understand the mechanisms of action of these drugs, their therapeutic utility, and also the reasons why people might abuse them. I have done a range of different studies. I am what some people would consider an experimentalist. I give people drugs and I look at the effects of those drugs on. Also, for the last 20 years I've had a significant interest and involvement in looking at the comparative harms of different drugs. A significant proportion of my academic recognition is now through that kind of research in addition to my scientific studies of the brain.
They understand.
If I could turn you, I believe there's an open file in front of you. It should be file 2 of 6. 149, that file. Professor Nutt?
This is my CV. Yes.
Have you reread the document recently?
I have.
I'd like to go through some of the contents of the CV with you. Under present position on page 1, the Edmund Psychopharmacology. Could you explain that to us, please?
So the SAFRA Foundation is a well-known international foundation that supports did a chair will allow me to move there and continue my research there. I was at Bristol University for 20 years before then. And my research is in the study of drugs on the brain.
Advise you to speak on neurological and psychiatric disorders.
Well, I trained as a neurologist first, and then as a psychiatrist subsequently. Come together pharmacology.
What is it, would you say, that you are best known for?
Internationally, I'm best known for my work on comparative drug harms. Analysis of the harms of different drugs using techniques which I've pioneered and then developed with the expertise of others.
And how is it that you became to be known internationally in this regard?
25, 30 years ago, I was working at the National Institute of Health in the USA and was running the research ward. And during that time, it became clear to me that alcohol was a very significant problem, causing serious brain as well as bodily damage to people. Actively marketed, whereas other drugs, which perhaps some of my patients were using, were actually illegal. And it seemed to me that what assessing the harms of different drugs with a view to understanding those harms both from the perspective of the drug on those harms. So that has been influential in the sense that in some countries now tobacco and alcohol are no longer advertised because the health therefore reducing consumption. As a result of that interest, I've written several chapters in books about that. I was invited to join a very influential British committee. Was the first serious review of the British drug laws that had taken place in 30 years. It was an extremely well-received review. I was the medical expert on that scale for assessing drug harms. That report received a lot of commendation from the media as well as scientists, and as a result of that I was asked to look at the harms of drugs and to help them arbitrate on the appropriate classification of drugs and decisions as to whether drugs should be made illegal or not. Panel that looked at pharmacology and toxicology, the so-called technical committee. This was a committee that looked at the science of drugs. And during that time, those techniques were used within the Home Office, which is our Ministry of Homeland Decisions, including at that time as well as teachers and other medical experts and across a range of disciplines to validate the first prototypical assessment scale. Home Office at the time, the scale was validated by reference to the addiction psychiatrists who were members of the Royal College of Psychiatry. Attempt to systematically compare the harms of drugs using a transparent and validated scale. That particular heavily and it led to a professor at the London School of Economics called Larry Phillips approach me with an understanding of how it could be improved. Take this approach forward, and we were educated into this technique called multi-criteria decision analysis, which is a relatively new approach. People make decisions in areas where there is limited data, and also where there is data across a different set of parameters. For you to take it today, if you were to take a dose of this drug, what harm would that have on you? And then of course that grades from taking it once to taking it repeatedly to becoming dependent. Mentions the impact of using that drug on your family and on society, and the economic cost of using a drug, and the economic costs of treating people for using drugs, and the road traffic accidents that drug. Drugs, for instance, as you know, using drugs through the intravenous route is one of the main reasons why HIV can take hold and be spread. They funded a conference to evaluate what the harms of drugs were across the whole spectrum, from economic harm right through to the personal harm of a drug being used. Which a drug can do harm. There are 9 harms to the user, and there are 7 harms to society. And from then on, we have used this multi-criteria decision. Conducted several studies, including one recently in South Africa, looking at different drugs and also different formulations of the same drug. And this has now become accepted, I believe.
Turning back to page 149 of your CV, under the heading of Psychopharmacology, Head of the Centre for Neuropsychopharmacology in the Division of Brain Science, Department of Medicine, Hammersmith Hospital, Imperial College, London. It says you are also a visiting professor at the In the next paragraph, it says that you completed your clinical training at Guy's Hospital in London. What did that training involve?
Said at the time, the leading teaching hospital in London, if not Britain, and that was a clinical training as a medical student, 3 years of clinical experience.
To MRCP. What is MRCP?
That is the higher qualification in neurology, so that is a specialist qualification in medicine for
Says you moved to Oxford to a research position. Explain that to us, please.
So in Oxford, the MRC, the Medical Research Council in Britain, had set up pharmacology, Smith, and that was the leading research unit in the country interested in how drugs work in the brain. So I was fortunate in persuading Professor Graham Smith
that what you refer to where you say where you obtained your DM?
Yes, a Doctor of Medicine is an Oxford higher degree in medicine. It's a subject, it's awarded on the basis of, it's like a...
And upon completing your psychiatric training in Oxford, what happened then?
I became a Wellcome Senior Fellow. That is the highest level of fellow, a scientist, clinical research scientist. And then I was approached by the National Institute of Health in America to go to NIH to run the research ward on alcohol. 2 years, but I didn't stay because unfortunately the Americans didn't recognize the British medical qualification, and they wanted me to go back and redo medicine there as a junior. So then I moved back to England.
When was that?
So I moved back to England in 1988 to the University of Bristol, where I set up a unit called the Psychopharmacology Unit to study the psychiatric brain.
Just broadly, if you could assist us by explaining those concepts, psychiatric and psychoactive effects.
So I'm a practitioner psychiatrist. I treat patients with a range of different psychiatric disorders. My particular specialty in psychiatry is the use of medicines, drugs. It's because I'm an expert in drugs. So I ran the Europe with difficult to treat psychiatric and neurologic disorders who could benefit from the use of drugs. But I also researched how these drugs work. So antidepressants work, how anxiolytics work, and also pioneered the use of buprenorphine, Subutex as it's sometimes known, in the treatment of opiate dependence problems.
Lord, if the witness is going too fast, my Lord, please,
No, it's fine.
you'll guide us. Thank you, my Lord. It then says, you returned to England to set up the Psychopharmacology Unit in Bristol University, an interdisciplinary research grouping spanning the departments of psychiatry and pharmacology before moving to Imperial College London. Tell us about that.
In the world, I had been a visiting professor there for 15 years, and actually a lot of my research was done there, but that involved me taking patients all the way from to when they made me an offer in 2008 to move there, it was a bit easier to do the research because we could recruit patients locally from London rather than have to recruit from each way, and if there's no problems on the motorway.
It says there you lead a similar group with a particular focus on brain imaging, especially PET.
Yes. The most sophisticated way of looking into the brain we have. It allows us to ask questions about what drugs do in the brain. Where does a drug like, you've probably heard of diazepam, a benzodiazepine, that calms people, helps them sleep. We did the first study to see where these receptor targets were different in people who had anxiety disorders compared with who didn't have anxiety. So we were able to show that people who were very anxious So this was the first proof that a psychiatric disorder like anxiety had a brain substrate which could explain it. European organization, which was set up, I think 12 years ago now, it was set up at the request of the European Commission, which is the overarching administrative body for the decision-making alongside the European Parliament. It's the decision-making part, the heart of the European community. And about 13 years ago, the groups, that there were so many of them, and there were so many disorders relating to the brain, and there were so many groups trying to talk to them and promote their demands. Said that they wanted to rationalize their interaction with the medical communities, and they requested all the people involved in anything to do with brain. And in a similar way, there's a council for cardiovascular disease, there's a council for cancer, and these councils represent Europe to the Commission. So the So I do what presidents do, which is I chair meetings and help direct policy.
And the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs?
Committee. I set it up in 2009 when, after a well-documented and well-reported falling out between me and my government, almost all the other scientists on the council resigned in protest because my dismissal was occasioned by a disagreement about comparative harms. Based on science. And our Misuse of Drugs Act, 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, specifically says that the scientific evidence. That our act was in breach of its own principles, in that drugs were being controlled inappropriately. I presented that to the government. It was unacceptable, unscientific, and over the course of the year I was a chairman of that council, tried to work with separate Home Secretaries, the ministers, by actively ignoring the scientific evidence. And eventually they became irritated by my pressure was coming up. They'd have more chance if they sacked me. They didn't win the election, but I was no longer their advisor. As a result of that, I was approached by various charities and asked to Scientific Committee on Drugs, which now is called drugscience.org.uk.
And do you hold any position at that committee?
Well, I'm currently the chair of that committee. The senior scientists who were on the government's advisory committee. So I say with only one exception, they all resigned and they've all joined my committee. So I have experts in toxic epidemiology, in drug policy, in criminology. It's an hugely powerful expert group. It's in essence the top experts in drugs and
Tell us about the British Neuroscience Association.
My research involves the brain. That brain research is often called neuroscience research. The British Neuroscience Association that promotes is one of the leading claims that Britain has to being at the top, very top table in terms of science. We have an organisation called the British Neuroscience Association which represents neuroscientists, and I was very pleased to be elected president of that a few years ago, and I served that post for 2 years. Because research is becoming quite challenging now in most Western countries as funding is harder to come by, particularly after the financial crash. So I took that job on to try to see if won more Nobel Prizes than any other branch of science in Britain, apart from physics. And it's, as I say, it's one of the areas where Britain still is absolutely world leading.
College.
Yes, I was a physician. I am a physician, so I've been elected a Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and a Fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists because I'm a psychiatrist too. Means that you've achieved a certain status in the eyes of your colleagues. So it's usually awarded after about 20 years of practice in the field.
Of psychiatrists and of the Academy of Medical Sciences.
Yeah, the Academy of Medical Sciences was set up about 18 parallel to the Royal Society. The Royal Society was, as you probably know, was founded 400 years ago to promote science in the United Kingdom, and it was the first of the great international scientific societies. Government set up or started the process to set up an academy for medical sciences to mirror the Royal Society. So it's the top 1,000 government in terms of health policy and health research.
What is the European?
Course that I am the UK representative on that course. It's the first international or European Masters in Psychiatry that has ever been set up. Psychiatrists together to learn about, particularly about anxiety and depressive disorders, because those tend to be poorly taught to trainees in psychiatry.
Why would you say they are poorly taught?
Well, because in terms of the pecking order for medical investment, disorders like schizophrenia virtually unfunded, because so many people think that anxiety is not a disorder. It's just something you have, you know, when you're taking your driving test. But as I say to people, just imagine what, you know, that reason one morning, which is what many of my patients experience. Imagine how debilitating that is. And when you understand that, then you realize that anxiety disorders are a huge problem.
National Centre for Science in Drug Policy?
Yes, I was asked to join that a few years ago, and I was pleased to do that because having done this work to look at how drugs international experts.
What is the Journal of Psychopharmacology?
The Journal of Psychopharmacology it is the journal of my national association, the British Association of Psychopharmacology, which I was once president. Studies on the effects of drugs and the brain.
And your involvement with that journal?
I'm the editor of that journal. I have been for nearly 20 years now. The pharmaceutical formulary that is used by the National Health Service. So it's essentially a book of drugs. It's up on psychiatric drugs. So my role there is to make sure that what the formulary says about these drugs is correct, to ensure that there's not any mismatch between what the pharmacists say and what doctors do in practice. So I check the depositions and I make sure that.
But your publications, if any?
Well, I've published, as it says here, over 400 original research papers, so those are independent pieces of research. I published over 500 books, including one which I focused at the general public called Drugs Without the Hot Air, which won the Transmission Prize for communicating science to the public. The Transmission Prize is a relatively recent prize set up by a group of individuals who are non-scientists, but who wanted to learn more. Rather fashionable in Britain. And there are people who go to hear scientists speak in the way they might go and hear theatre critics speak or novelists speak. And then every year they give this award called the Transmission Prize for the book that best communicates science to the general public. So I have written books across this field of psychopharmacology. I've written or edited. I mean, mostly these books are edited. They're not written by me. They're definitive book on anxiety disorders, a very major book on drug abuse and drug mechanisms, which came out of one of the government reports I worked on.
It says that you have been a member and chair of the advisory committee on the
and I was on that committee for 10 years, 9 years as chair of the scientific committee, and then 1 year as the full chair of the council. Of psychopharmacology, and I was president of that for 2 years.
The European College of Neuropsychopharmacology.
So that is a years. It's the largest neuropsychopharmacology organization in the world. At its peak, it was getting over 7,000 delegates.
It says you're a member of the HEFCE/NHS Senior Lecturer Select.
The high, so that was a panel that made awards to individuals who were looking to become promoted to research senior lecturers. Funder for brain research in Britain is also the main funder of all medical research. So the brain research is funded through an organisation called the Neuroscience Board, which consists of them and make decisions on what gets funded and what doesn't.
And then it says you served as the medical expert on the independent
What I mentioned earlier on in how my career developed, I was appointed to that as the medical expert. And that's where I began to develop the prototypical drug assessment scheme that I have. The first systematic review of the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act that had happened in the UK. It was funded by a charity called the Police Foundation, who were initially set up to enact, and in fact they might be leading to some cases of injustice rather than justice. Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. She'd served on that. She had been influential in persuading our Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, to change her policy on needle exchange. And remarkable woman, chair of a major NHS trust. And she was a very impressive chairperson for this inquiry. The inquiry lasted through members of the public and me as a doctor. And the report was seen as a landmark assessment of the state of the inquiry was reported very widely in the media. It encouraged the government to set up its first ever depending on its formulation, was either in Class A, the most penalised class, or Class B, the second most penalised class of our Misuse of Drugs Act, which pointed out the anomalies in the choice of class for cannabis. We recommended cannabis be removed to Class C. And several years a separate committee, which I also served on, which concurred with the Runseran report, and cannabis was downgraded in 2004. And to this day, it's the only time classified under the Misuse of Drugs Act in the UK. Tens of drugs have had their classification increased, but the Act was supposed to allow free movement up and down according to harm.
What are the implications of it being downgraded from Class A to Class C?
Well, the downgrading had one major implication, which was that the penalties for and similarly the penalties for dealing were reduced from life imprisonment to 14 years.
Safety of Medicines.
So the Committee on Safety of Medicines is the medical equivalent of the British National Formulary, but it has a greater role besides allowed as a medicine in Britain. So it determines whether the efficacy and the safety of a drug meets the criteria what the Americans call the FDA.
That would be the
Federal
Drug Agency.
Agency, that's right. So I served on that, and I was one of the 2 psychiatric members of that. Psychiatric and neurologic and pain disorders. And actually, and this may be of interest to the courts, I was on that committee when Sativex, the combination was first presented as a possible medicine. So I'm well aware of the issues relating to cannabis products as medicines. An extract. Sativex is a spray. It's a liquid spray that you spray into your mouth, and it contains a combination of 3.4 milligrams of THC. This is the active, the stoning ingredient in cannabis, but also one of the main less of this other substance called cannabidiol. Now, cannabidiol is a non-psychoactive component of the cannabis plant, which seems to have medical properties. Maybe brain stress, but when used with THC, it moderates the stoning effect, the high that the THC can produce. So to the THC.
The Committee on NHS Drugs.
That is a committee that decides whether then the Committee on NHS Drugs decides whether the NHS will pay for it. So the NHS committee might well decide, well, the drugs we've got already, which are cheaper, so we're only going to pay for the cheaper ones and not the new one. And that committee was set up to get around the problem of what we call Me Tooism. In some 10 different variants of the same drug. And the ones that come in first usually are, when they're on the market for a certain time, they become lower in price, they become generic, and then different. We had to decide whether the newer drugs were cost effective, and if they were, we put them into the NHS list, but if they weren't, we didn't. An expert on that committee for several years. I mean, obviously, defence science is not just about weapons and about armour. I've edited 2 major books on post-traumatic stress disorder. I was working on this committee to try to help the military develop the most appropriate research
The UK Government Foresight Initiative Brain Science, Addiction and Drugs. Tell us about that.
Foresight group. The Foresight group takes two challenges each year. It sets up committees which run for about 2 years. Relevance to the UK over the next 25 years. So they deal with topics like flood defences, like global warming, like decided the way science would affect the use and the misuse and the harms of drugs over the next 25 years. That was a very turned into a book for the public, because we said things like the internet within 10 years will be the major source of drug dealing. At that time, back of clubs and the back of pubs, and of course we were right. The internet is now way the most influential element in the use of many drugs. Could be developing new treatments, and how we had to develop new strategies. So this became not a blueprint, but it became the test bed against which government policies on drugs and drug addiction.
To what extent did your involvement in these various committees and advisory boards relate to cannabis in particular?
So cannabis has always been illegal drugs, so-called illegal drugs, was by far and away the one that was most widely used. We dedicated a separate chapter to cannabis. Cannabis does have a very special role. Some of our student populations, 80% of the students will have used cannabis, because in the time from 1970 to 2005, translates into probably 100-fold increase in the amount of use. So we always recognized that cannabis was a particularly important and a challenging drug. In a different drugs, because of its normalization in society. So I can say all those reports kind of reading today in terms of the legislative approach to cannabis, but the Foresight report, cannabis, goes through there. A lot of interest in that report on the development.
Have you been publicized in the media?
I've done quite a lot of work in the media. I haven't listed it all here. It's just too long and tedious. But I think I'm now seen a turn if they want to get the truth about drugs, because I tell the truth. That's what got me dismissed from the government. And I'm very happy to talk to me in this whole public domain. So the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs that I set up has a website, which I believe is the only truly independent website on drugs. Users, what you see there is what my expert panel, and they are special experts, have determined are the truths about the drugs. Many journalists go there further.
Given that you say the media tends to come to you for the truth about drugs, why would anyone not give the truth about drugs?
Many of in this room will realize drugs are probably the most politicized branch of science ever. Global warming, the majority of scientists are on side. Drugs, scientists polarize. They polarize according to the source of funding and according to their religious and political beliefs. Get core truth about what drugs do and how harmful they may do. And of course it's complicated by the fact that drugs are illegal, and therefore research on drugs is limited, much too. And of course this becomes a self-serving cycle. So little research is done on cannabis because it's illegal. It's very to make it a medicine. Because the current legal situation makes research virtually impossible.
Going back to your having been broadcast in the media,
The Life Scientific is a recent program which takes top scientists and interviews them for half an hour in the same way as authors, musicians. Scientific is has a lot of listeners who are interested in learning about scientists, so that's a great honour to be on the Life Scientific. I've made BBC programs. I've made the first detailed imaging study of cannabis and cannabidiol, which we did as part of a Channel 4 broadcast. And I'm very keen to talk to schools and to the public.
lecturing?
Yes, well, I lecture a lot. I probably give scientific groups like the Café Scientifique, and also there's skeptics in the pub, and I give a lot of lectures to university society. So the Times, you know the Times of London, it set up a weekly science magazine back in about 2009, and in 2010 it was honoured to be one of those.
Were there other psychiatrists on the list?
No, I was the only psychiatrist. So Nature, you probably know, the scientists here will know, Nature is one of the leading, perhaps the leading scientific journal in the world. It's been going for over 150 years. John Maddox was very long. When I was a junior researcher, when I was doing some of my basic research, I was publishing in Nature. And when he died, his family and also the council Sense About Science is a British charity that promotes science. It does for other areas of science what drug science does for drugs. There is an award of the John Maddox Prize, and it's given to individuals who have promoted good science in the face of opposition. And I was lucky enough to be the second awardee, which was considered considerable opposition at the time.
Under the heading qualifications on page 150 of your CV, from 1972 to 2002. For those of us not in the field, if you could just explain what those qualifications are.
So 1972, the BA. Then in 1975, following my clinical training at Guy's Hospital, I then became a master, a BM, a Bachelor of Medicine, and a B Chair, a Bachelor London, and then MA as a Master of Arts and an MB as a Bachelor of Medicine, etc. in Oxford, and then a DM, a Doctor of Medicine in Oxford, and then MRC Psych. Psychiatrist, FMed Sci Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, and FRCP Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians. That's my registration number as a doctor. Yes.
Take us through some of the positions you've held.
Well, I started off, I'm proud of this, before I went to university, laboratory technician, working on those newly discovered substances called prostaglandins, which now turned out to be a very interesting aspect of medicine. And then when I house hospital, and then various senior house officer jobs, senior residents, clinical scientist, where I did my research in Oxford, and then onto the Oxford training scheme as a senior fellowship, the Wellcome Senior Fellowship, which is a very prestigious, it's the top Wellcome award. Very few scientists, let alone psychiatrists, get it. Pharmacology unit, was made a professor in Bristol in '94, and then I did various jobs in the university as head of department, dean of medicine, and actually one of
And you list a number of awards and prizes. Could you explain what those awards and prizes are?
Well, some scholars. I won a few of the prizes at Guy's Hospital. I was one of their better students, I think.
What is the...
Sorry, my lord. Are we going to see them?
Do you
Line
accept
by
the
line,
CV
yes.
for purposes of this? Do you accept the witnesses' CV as set out? Is
Yes,
that what you say?
yes.
It's not in dispute.
It's not in dispute.
Mr.
Explanation of what they are, one doesn't know whether differing opinions between experts might turn on the nature of the qualifications. So an explanation of what they are would be of value to your lordship. No, I'll move on.
I'll just comment on the Daily Telegraph, Britain of the Year, top 25. The Daily Telegraph is a rather right-wing newspaper, so that was a serious my research. So.
Under the learned societies by examination or election, if you could just explain
The status of a physician, psychiatrist, the Royal College does the same. The British Association of Psychopharmacology is an organisation that European equivalent of that. The CIMP is the international equivalent of that. And then the British Pharmacological Society is the professional group for pharmacologists.
Next.
Mr. Mahon, Mr. Bokaba indicated that they don't dispute the qualifications, etc., in the CV. Yes.
Lord, am I to assume...
Perhaps a better approach would be to focus on the witness.
Yes.
Tougher. Yeah. Because quite a lot is because of the extensive and wide
Yes.
experience of different drugs. So if we're going to go through the CV, it's going to be... Mr. Willis dispute, or do you
No.
accept this? You don't?
No.
Thank you, my Lord. Perhaps I could pose it then in this more constructive way, my Lord.
Yes.
Professor, could you worthy, given what you know to be the issues in this case?
Yes. So, if we go down to page 152, MRC. So that was working to define the remit of the MRC in terms of addiction research. Board. Academic research on addiction comes through that board. And then the ICAM research cluster, which was a major Manchester universities to form the National Lead Centre for Addiction Research. And then, obviously, government responsibility talked about. I would say, and this is relevant, I believe, when I was chair of the Advisory Council, I pushed very hard and was successful in getting a cross drugs and build bridges between the different sectors, because one of the problems with drugs and drug harms is that they aren't just the province of the law or the health ministries or the judiciary. No facility across the whole of addiction. So I was pleased to be able to persuade my ministers that such a group should be set up. And then the other thing I'm very proud of is at the very bottom of that page. And it stands the test of time today, and it covers all aspects of drugs, from economics right through to molecular science. I've given evidence on page 153. Interesting committee. It was a committee that I gave evidence to, and I can say honestly, thinking that it wasn't about herbal cannabis, plant cannabis. I argued that the availability at the time of THC as dronabinol and also synthetic THC. But I began to change my mind. And their report is a wonderful report, and I would commend it to all of you, because their reports still stand the test of time 17 years on. Interest groups in Parliament, I speak probably once or twice a year on drugs to all those. Just going down there. into alcohol, tobacco and other drugs. I've refereed huge numbers of grant applications. I can of my life. I worked for a period for a company called Reckitt and Coleman. Reckitt and Coleman invented buprenorphine. They invented Subutex. Tried to persuade them that Subutex should be made available as a treatment for heroin addiction. And they refused. And even though I was their senior scientist, they refused to go into and they never got into that field while I worked for them. I worked for them for 4 years, and then they pulled out of research, so I left. And it was only about another 3 years later when they were going back that subsequently showed that we were right. Buprenorphine Subutex is a very, very valuable treatment for addiction. But that emphasizes the fact that when drugs are controlled and when field. And so of all these companies I've consulted for in the fields of addiction, of schizophrenia and anxiety and sleep disorders and depression, almost none of them were credible into addiction.
Thank you. Mr. Professor, I see it's 4 o'clock now.
Yes,
Take the adjourn. Thank you.
adjourn for today. Thank you. The court adjourns.
Paul.